What feels like running out of willpower is actually just your brain switching modes. Here's why this matters. If you don't adjust with your brain's shifts, then everything in your day will start to feel like you're pushing uphill. Then you'll start asking yourself, why can't I just focus? What's wrong with me? Or worse, you'll tell yourself, I'm a failure because I don't have 100% self-control 24/7. But here's what's really going on. Your brain has two modes, tunnel mode and open mode. When it's in tunnel mode, it grabs one thing and shuts the rest of the world out, is more goal-driven, distraction-resistant, and able to power through hard tasks. When it shifts into open mode, however, it opens the door and lets new ideas wander in. It sees the whole picture and the links between information, and it's much more flexible. In short, tunnel mode is for finishing. Open mode is for exploring. Now, neither mode is better. They're just two different strategies your brain uses depending on the context you're in and what you're trying to achieve. This also highlights a new angle as to why you give in to temptation. It's not necessarily that your willpower ran out when you find yourself scrolling the night away or binge watching Netflix or eating a tub of ice cream. It's just more so your brain opened the door to open mode, stepped in and left the door open behind it. So here's what to do next. The next time you're in tunnel mode, but it feels as if your willpower is starting to weaken, your attention slips and starts scanning for an exit door, or your muscles start fatiguing during a workout, or the more you try and focus on something, the more your mind tires, reframe the signal not as a sign that you need to push harder, but as a sign that your brain is changing modes. And then just take your foot off the gas pedal a little bit. If writing gets hard and heavy, stand up, walk away from your desk and go on a walk around the block. When the push during a workout fades, don't quit, just change the intensity. And instead of reading more, go and clean your room. But in a general sense, if staying locked in on the task that you feel as if your willpower is weakening towards is important, then don't abandon the task, just adjust how you're doing it. And then just before we address the big elephant in the room here, how this relates to resisting temptation is simple. Well, understand that when it comes to resisting temptation, the best way to do it isn't to rely on sheer will or sheer effort alone, as if you have a tub of ice cream in front of you and you're like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. No, understand the best way to resist temptation is to prepare for the moments when your brain is going to shift into open mode. And what that means is capitalize on the natural motivation and desire for removing distraction your brain has when it's in tunnel mode. Practically, that could look like looking at all of the environments, looking at all of the objects in your environment as cues for your attention. And when you pay your attention to them, there's a necessary next action that you'll take after you see that cue and that object. Is that object pulling you into the slippery slope of temptation? Is it going to deplete your energy after you do that action? Or is it serving your best interests? And then just remove all of the things that are pulling you into temptation. Remove your phone from the environment, the easy access technology, the junk food, all of that stuff. So that when you're in tunnel mode, so that by the time your brain shifts into open mode and it opens that door to flexible thinking and it lets new things wander in, it goes, right, what we got? Where's the distraction? Oh, there's not a lot. Right, well, let me just do this thing that serves my best interest then. Prepare to open. Now, the big elephant in the room here is going back to the idea of your brain shifting modes when it feels as if your willpower is weakening. You might be thinking, okay, Lewis, well, let's say I'm about to sit down and try and focus on something, but I notice my brain is getting distracted and I'm getting the impulse and urge to scroll on my phone rather than doing this hard thing. Is that my brain changing modes, and if so, should I let it? Or is it a genuine distraction? Here's my answer. There are two types of resistance you'll face when you're trying to do something with willpower: doorway and exit resistance. Doorway resistance is that urge for distraction you feel early on when you're doing something. The reason why we call it doorway resistance is because if you surf the urge for 5 to 10 minutes of that distraction, it will disappear and it will be like you're opening a new door into the flow of the activity. Your energy here is sharp and the underlying feeling is, oh, this is hard, but this is just what I need to push through in order to get to flow. So the rule with doorway resistance is if it gets easier, and what we mean by gets easier is if the effort you're putting in and the persistence that you're showing results in that resistance decreasing, stay. Exit resistance, on the other hand, is the urge for distraction you feel even after having persisted through the urges. If the feeling of doorway resistance is, oh, this is hard, the feeling of exit resistance is, this isn't working anymore, no matter what I'm doing. You know, your focus drops despite effort, you're rereading the same line, your energy feels flat. Why? Because your brain in exit resistance genuinely wants to switch modes. So the rule here is if it gets worse, switch. You know, step away from your desk, go for a walk, call a friend, change the intensity of what you're doing. A cool question to ask yourself to differentiate between the two is the next time you feel that urge for distraction when you're trying to push through something with willpower, ask, am I at the doorway or am I actually done? And then stay for 10 more minutes. You know, you can even set a timer. And if after those 10 more minutes of extra effort, if the resistance increases and gets louder, switch modes and adjust the task. But if it decreases and quietens, then stay and persist. This is the main takeaway I want you to have from this whole video. So if this all makes sense, feel free to, bounce. Click off the video right now, and I wish you all the best with your new understanding of willpower. But if you would like to go a few minutes deeper, then here's what we're going to wrap up this video with. The old idea of how willpower works, and then the origins of the tunnel versus open mode idea. Cool, then we'll summarize. Point number one, the old idea of how willpower works. The idea that willpower is like some internal resource that the more we use, the more it fatigues, started in the mid to late 1990s, and psychologists call it ego depletion. Now, on the surface as an idea, the idea that willpower is like a muscle that fatigues the more you use it makes a lot of sense because it maps with our inner experience of willpower, right? The more I make decisions, the more temptations I resist throughout the day, the more I try and focus, the more likely I am to arrive at my sofa in the evening and binge the night away watching Netflix and eating ice cream, right? That makes sense to us logically. But as the cognitive neuroscientist Alberto highlighted in the article that he wrote that I read in researching for this video, the more psychologists recently in worldwide studies have tried to pin down this idea of ego depletion and back it up with more studies, the more the idea just kind of slipped through their fingers. The bottom line is the idea that willpower is a muscle that tires is being questioned. So if it doesn't hold up, if it feels right but doesn't hold up to scientific investigation, then we need a new way of thinking about willpower. So this is where the big idea of this video nicely slots into. Tunnel versus open mode. Of course, this is what we've been speaking about. Now, the origins of this idea come from the psychologist Bernard Hummel, and he termed it meta-control theory. The specific terms he used weren't tunnel versus open mode. He called it persistent versus flexible mode. I just turned it into tunnel versus open because it's a bit more palatable and visual. Now, what we know is, of course, neither mode is better. They are just two strategies your brain uses to, depending on what you're trying to achieve, the strategies you're using to achieve those things, and how you feel. Tunnel mode, of course, can be understood with the examples of it's you pushing through the final hour of studying or work, or pushing through a grueling workout. Open mode is, of course, when you're going for a walk around the block, you're chilling, you're calling your friends, or you're stood in front of a whiteboard, for example, just brainstorming ideas, much more flexible. Now, the cool thing about meta-control theory is it aligns with two, in my opinion, fascinating subjects. One is evolution. through the lens of meta-control theory, we can understand that this was very useful for our ancestors, being able to switch modes, because it would have been very dangerous for a caveman, for example, to use that simplistic term, to have only been able to hyperfixate on something to the point of exhaustion. Because hyperfixation, being in tunnel mode, obviously means your brain is blocking out distractions from the rest of the world, which would have been costly for a caveman to have done that all the time because predators were around and he had to be able to switch modes to be a bit more flexible and be like, okay, what's actually going on here? Let me not just be tunneled in, dialed in to one thing, because I don't want to creep up on me. But at the same time, if human beings were never able to hyperfixate on something and we was only in open mode all of the time, then nothing would have got done. So there are two strategies our brain uses. And the final subject this maps onto and aligns with is modern neurobiology. So Alberto De Luca, again in his article, highlighted that the dopamine activity in your brain and where that is happening determines what mode your brain gets into. To put it in simplistic terms, when dopamine is firing, or the dopamine activity in your brain is firing at the front parts of your brain, that's when you're more likely to be goal-driven, distraction, resistant, and in tunnel mode. But when that dopamine activity goes to the deeper parts of your brain, that's when you're much more likely to be in open, flexible mode. So don't worry about remembering that. I just thought the neurobiology was fascinating. Anyway, in summary, let's cut through the noise and wrap up. You don't have a willpower problem, you have a mode mismatch. So my mini experiment for you over the next few days after this video is, the next time you notice you're trying to do something with willpower and push through, but the more you try and push, the louder the resistance gets, take a pause and just ask yourself, am I forced in tunnel mode when my brain wants open mode? And then stay for 10 more minutes. But if the resistance increases, no matter how much more effort you try and put in, don't try and increase your effort more, just adjust the task. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Stay disciplined, playful and dangerous. Adios, muchachos y muchachas.